Alrighty folks, and welcome to my restorative gardening course. I am so excited that you're here and taking part in this, because over the course of the next 6 videos here, I'm going to teach you and walk you through how to go about building a garden that not only brings you fruits and vegetables, but really that brings you so much more, that restores you, that brings you peacefulness, that brings you joy. And so for those of you that I haven't met before, I'm Jordan and I run a company called Mind and Soil, where I'm hoping to introduce 1 million individuals to gardening's mental health benefits. And a big philosophy of mine is that anytime that we try something new, it can actually be a little bit daunting, a little bit overwhelming, a little bit stressful, which is the opposite of what we want the garden to be and to feel like. And so over the course of these 6 videos, I'm going to be right by your side, helping you get comfortable in the garden, getting your hands dirty so they can truly become a restorative practice for you. So with that being said, I want to go ahead and begin diving straight in. And so for lesson number 1 here today, it's entirely focused on planning the perfect garden. And so you might be wondering right now how to go about planning or turning your outdoor space into a garden. Maybe it's a blank canvas right now. Maybe you have some raised beds, but you don't know how to go about getting the right vegetables in there and giving them the right amount of spacing. Well, by the end of this video, you're gonna know exactly how to turn your backyard, your patio, truly any space into an incredible garden. And so to accomplish this, we're gonna break the lesson down into 5 key steps. And the very first step is simply reflection. So what I encourage you to do is actually grab our garden planning guide, which you can find on our website at mindandsoil.com. It's completely free, and it's gonna have everything that you need to go about planning out your garden. And so for that very first step, the first question that we wanna ask ourselves is simply, what is one word that I'm hoping for my garden to bring me next year? So is it bounty? Is it harvest? Or maybe it's peacefulness, restoration, happiness, joy, connection. Spend a couple of minutes here thinking through what that one word is for yourself. Now for me, the word that you've already heard me mention a couple times is restoration. And so for me, anytime that I'm feeling stressed or anxious or overwhelmed or just burnt out a little bit from the week, when I go into the garden and I get my hands into the soil, immediately I start feeling all of my energy getting restored, and that allows me to then show up as my best self in all the other endeavors in my life. So spend a couple of minutes thinking through what you hope the garden brings you this season, and then let's dive into question number 2, which is just, what vegetables do you love to eat? And I really encourage you to not spend more than 1 or 2 minutes on this question. Write down the vegetables that are coming into your mind right now. And so for myself, that includes kale for some salads, basil so I can make some pesto, tomatoes because who doesn't love tomatoes, and zucchinis, a super fun one to grow that get absolutely massive. Now the reason why we want to be focusing on vegetables that we love to eat is because that's immediately going to make us a little bit more invested in how they do. Now the reason why we want to focus on vegetables that we love is, 1, obviously because we enjoy eating them, but more so is because it's more likely to pull us into the garden, because we're going to care more about having that plant be successful, having it really thriving, and getting to enjoy that harvest later on in the season. So to bring this to life with an example, garlic is a vegetable that I absolutely love to eat. And as a result, I've been growing tons of garlic over the years. And every single year, I'm running a whole bunch of different experiments around spacing, depth, amount of sunlight, different amendments that I'm putting into the soil to figure out the best way to be growing garlic. What that results in is garlic that's really great, but also me just having so much fun in the garden because I'm trying to figure out all these different variables and what helps this plant grow best. So again, don't spend more than 2 or 3 minutes on thinking through which vegetables you love to eat. And the third and final question that we're going to answer for step number 1 here is simply, what's one vegetable that you're fascinated to try growing? So a vegetable or a fruit or a flower that you're not entirely sure if you're able to grow or how to go about kind of growing it as successfully as possible, but that you're really curious to figure out and to kind of crack the code on. And so for myself, that is onions. And so for myself, onions are something that I eat a ton of, but I haven't had tons of success growing so far. They're a little bit more challenging. It's difficult to get them to head up into the beautiful heads of onions that we would see in the grocery store. but because I eat them so much, I want to figure out how to do this one. And so that fascination that I have and that I hope that you find with a specific vegetable, again, it really immerses our mind, our energy in the garden, rather than thinking about what might be going on in life, at work, in relationship. When our mind is fascinated, it's fully present in the task at hand. So I really do encourage you to find one vegetable, it can be as simple or as complex of a vegetable as you would like, that you're fascinated, that you'd really love to figure out how to go about growing this season. Now, once you have written down that vegetable, we are all done and dusted on step number 1. We've got steps 2 through 5 to get through here, but the first one is all taken care of. So nice work on that. Alrighty, and so step number 2 here is to draw your garden space. So when we think about it, we've got a blank canvas in our backyard or our patio, and we now have these vegetables that we're really excited to be growing. But how do we actually go about getting them into the garden? Where do we go about placing them? That's what we're gonna figure out in step 2 here. And so what I encourage you to do as we begin diving in is, again, print out the garden planning guide that we have here, because within it, there is a piece of graph paper that is going to allow you to draw out that garden space. Now, just before we start drawing it out, let's take a look at my backyard here and start to utilize this as the canvas that we want to draw out. And so what we can see here is that there are 4 raised beds right down the middle of the garden here. Raised bed 1, raised bed 2, raised bed 3, and raised bed number 4. Now, just before we draw these onto the graph paper, if you don't have any garden space or raised beds set up yet, or if you're in a patio, hang tight for just a minute, because I'm going to answer those 2 questions and what to be doing in just a couple seconds here. But what we want to begin doing is getting our raised beds drawn onto the garden. And so to do so, we go down to our graph paper and we assume that each line represents 1 foot. So 1 line over would equal 1 foot. And now what I know with my raised beds is that they are 4 feet in width and 8 feet in length. So I'm just going to draw 4 lines over and then 8 lines up. And then I'm just going to draw 4 more lines over and 8 lines down to complete that raised bed. And now I know that I have about 1 foot of space between those raised beds. So I'm going to leave a gap of 1 foot, and then I'm going to go ahead and start drawing the second raised bed. So 8 lines up, 4 lines over, 8 lines up, and then 4 lines over again. And voila, raised bed number 2 is drawn out. And I'm just going to repeat this process for raised bed number 3 and raised bed number 4. And with them all drawn out, what we can now start thinking through is, how do I go about getting those vegetables that we outlined in step number 1 placed into the garden beds that we've now drawn out here. But just before we do that, I want to touch on those 2 questions for those of you that might not have any garden space established or are growing in a patio environment. And so in that particular instance, what I want you to do is draw out the outline of your space. So the outer perimeter of your entire outdoor space. So using this patio as an example, what I would do is I'd head out there with a measuring tape and I would measure each of the different angles, and then I'd begin to draw those onto the graph paper here. And with something like the curve, it doesn't need to be 100% perfect, but I do encourage you to measure it out just to get it as accurate as possible. Alrighty, and so now that we have the outline of the perimeter of this kind of outdoor space drawn out, the next thing that we want to do is essentially just black off any areas that we can't be growing in. So let's say that you had some outdoor furniture in that area. Well, you're going to want to go ahead and then block that off by just filling in black squares there. And then maybe you have a couple chairs on the other side that are also blocking some space. We're going to go ahead and black those ones out as well. That way we know that that space is kind of off limits when it comes to where we're going to be placing our plants. And so what I'm hoping that you're starting to see on your drawing here is now a whole bunch of black boxes that are off limits for growing in, but also a whole bunch of white clear boxes here that we're able to potentially begin utilizing as growing space. And so if you are in a patio or smaller environment, my encouragement to you on this front is to not go down the path of raised beds, but rather to be utilizing containers or grow bags. And these are effectively just smaller vehicles for us ultimately to be placing and kind of moving throughout our gardening space, and that we're ultimately going to be filling up with soil and growing out of. And I'm going to touch on all of that, how to go about filling those up, really good soil blends, all of that stuff in lessons 3 and 4 of this course. But for right now, just know that you'll be utilizing grow bags or containers in a smaller environment. And if you're in a larger environment, let's say that you have a backyard for the very first time, you've just drawn it out, but you don't have any raised beds back there, don't feel like you need to be building raised beds in year one. As a matter of fact, I would actually encourage you to still utilize grow bags and containers in your first year. And the reason why is because there's so much that we're going to be learning in this first year. And the last thing that you want to do is put raised beds into part of your backyard without knowing really how the sun moves through it in this first season. Now all of a sudden you've maybe sunk this big kind of infrastructure investment into a part of your yard that isn't the best growing space. But if you had containers and grow bags, then you could start them in that area at the beginning of the season. And when you have that moment where you realize, oh, the sun's not actually great there, you could simply move them to another part of the yard. And that's going to allow you to figure out in this first season the best growing zones in your backyard, so that as you go into year two, you'd then be able to make that infrastructure investment and put those raised beds into your backyard. Now, speaking of the sun, the last thing that we want to do for step number 2 here is draw a little sun icon or multiple sun icons into our garden space. And this is essentially serving as a little reminder to us as to which beds get the most sun in the backyard and which ones get the least amount of sun. So for raised bed number 1, I'm going to put a full sun icon just beneath it here, because I know that that is a bed that gets really, really good sun, as does the second one. But when we get to the third raised bed, well, that's where I actually start to get about half sun in that bed. And you might be wondering, why does that happen? Well, it just ends up because of how my house is positioned and situated in relation to the sun, that my house starts to act as a little bit of a shade sail that blocks the sun from hitting that bed. So for me, beds 3 and 4, they don't get as much sun as beds number 1 and 2. And I want to take that information into consideration when I begin to space and place my vegetables into this garden that I've drawn out, which is exactly what we're going to be touching on in step number 3. Alrighty, folks. So step 3 is all around spacing and placing our vegetables into the garden that we've drawn out. And what I'm going to say as we dive into this third step of our 5 steps that we're going through is that this is the only one that might be a little bit complex or a little bit daunting at the beginning. But stick with me here for just like 5 more minutes, because once I go through the first and the second vegetable, you're actually going to see how simple and how easy this step is. But I know that it can be a little bit daunting at the very beginning as we begin diving in. So just hang with me here for kind of like 5 minutes. And on top of that, step 4 and step 5 are an absolute breeze. So this is the last kind of like area where there's gonna be a lot of information coming at you, and just hang with me through it. So when it comes to those vegetables that we're so excited to be growing, again, for me, kale, basil, tomatoes, zucchinis, we want to make sure that we get them into the garden in the most optimal growing conditions for each of them. And in that front, spacing and placing plays a really, really important role for 3 key reasons. The first one is sizing. So using basil as an example, it's a fairly small plant that isn't going to take up too much space. And so as a result of that, we can actually plant it fairly densely. We can fit multiple basil plants into 1 square foot. But on the other hand, a plant, say like cucumbers, is much larger, and it's going to sprawl, and it's going to climb, and it's going to take up tons and tons of space. So if we planted multiple cucumber plants in 1 square foot, they would not nearly have enough space to be growing successfully. They'd be shading each other out and ultimately beginning to really struggle. Now, the second key reason is because of sunlight. And so some of our vegetables are going to absolutely thrive in a full sun environment, and we want to dedicate that space for them, while as other ones, they're going to do just fine in a lower sunlight environment. So when we take, say, kale as an example, it's a vegetable that it's going to grow totally fine in a lower sun environment. But some of our larger plants, such as tomatoes, zucchinis, etc., they are going to thrive in a full sun environment, as much sun as possible for those babies to grow to their absolute fullest potential. So when it comes to ultimately spacing and placing them, we want to ensure that we're dedicating that full sun space to our plants that are going to thrive and ultimately benefit from it the most. And now the third and final consideration here is because some plants grow vertically. And so when we think about, say, our peas as an example, they're going to grow vertically. And if we put that right in the middle of our garden, it would ultimately create a shade sail that would block any plants that are behind them from getting the sunlight. And so we want to make sure that those plants that are growing vertically, we're putting them into the garden somewhere where they're not ultimately going to be creating a shade sail over some of our smaller plants. But we're not going to get it perfect in our first season, so don't stress over this. Use it just as a little bit of a guiding principle when it comes to placing your plants into the garden, and then absorb all of those learnings as you go through the season to then apply those into your second year of gardening. It truly is a lifelong practice, and every single gardener, whether they're in their third or fourth year or 30th or 40th year, is still learning new things. So take some kind of solace in that and don't stress over this at all. Now, with that being said, let's start actually spacing and placing our vegetables that we're so excited to be growing into the drawn out garden that we did in step 2 here. So what we want to do is go to page 3 of our garden planning guide where the space planner is located. And what we have here is every single vegetable that you potentially will be growing, and ultimately how much space they need, how densely we can plant them, and how much sunlight each of them requires. So all that we need to do now is look up our first vegetable. Again, using my example of kale, what I'm going to do is go down the list until I find kale. And then I'm going to go over to see how many squares are required for kale. And it says just 1 square is required. Perfect. Now, how many kale plants can I fit into that 1 square? Only 1 as well. And the last piece of information that I want is just how much sun is required. Half sun. Perfect. I've got all the information I need now to place my kale babies into my drawn out garden. So I go back over to my drawn out garden space and I look for an area to place my kale. So we know that it's fine in a lower sun environment. So I'm going to go into bed number 3 here, and all that I'm going to do is just simply write in the letter K for kale. And again, I know that it only requires 1 square, so I'm just going to put 1 square in place there. And now I want a couple of kale plants, so I'm going to go kale plant 2, 3rd box for kale, and a 4th box for kale. Perfect. Just like that, I know that this coming season, I've got kale in the garden. It's going to be growing, it's going to be thriving. We're in a good place with that vegetable. Now all that we do is we move on to our second vegetable that we wrote out in the very first step here, which was basil. So what do? I go to the space planner and I look up basil. How many squares are required for basil? Only 1. Now, how many basil plants can I fit into that square? Well, now it is 4. Okay, and lastly, how much sun is required for this basil plant? And they love a full sun environment. Perfect. I've got all the information that I need. We go back over to our drawn out garden space. And what I'm going to do is find one of my full sun beds. So I'm going to go with bed number 1 here. And again, all that I'm going to do is in one of the squares, I'm going to write the letter B for basil. But I'm going to want more than that, so I'm actually going to do a full row here and dedicate 4 squares of basil. Now keep in mind that we can plant this one more densely. The number of plants that we can fit into each of those squares is 4. So while there are 4 Bs written down, each of those represents 4 plants. So what that means is we've got 4, 8, 12, 16 basil plants that we can fit into just those 4 square feet. That's a lot of pesto that I'm going to be enjoying over the course of this summer. So I hope that you're already starting to see how simple and easy it is to space and place our vegetables into the garden. We're going to go through those last 2 that I wrote out. But what I encourage you to do as you kind of plan out your garden is start just playing around with placing different vegetables into your garden. Definitely do it with a pencil so that you can erase and move things around, and it's really going to become a second nature before you know it. So the 3rd vegetable that I had was tomatoes. So I go over to my space planner and I look up tomatoes, and then I go over and I see that this is on the large plant side. So now I look up how many squares are required for tomatoes, and it's gone to 2. So it's no longer just 1 square that we require, we now need 2. Now how many plants can I be fitting into those 2 squares? Only 1. And how much sun do our tomatoes require? Full sun. Perfect. I've got all the information that I need to now put that into my drawn out garden. So I go back to the drawing and I look for one of my full sun beds, and I'm going to put these right beside my basil. So all that I do is I write the letter T. But again, it requires 2 squares. So I'm actually going to draw a dotted line to make sure that I'm dedicating 2 squares for it. And then I'm going to continue that dotted line across so that the next one where I put the next T, it also has 2 squares dedicated. And I'm going to go up into the next row and I'm going to dot the lines so that I've set aside 2 squares here, and I'm going to put a second T for tomatoes and then a third T for tomatoes. And I'm going to do one more row here. I really love my tomatoes, so we're going to get a couple more in here. Now, one thing that I want you to notice is that I staggered those tomatoes. Rather than just doing a straight line down the bed, I was staggering them throughout. And the reason for this is because it's creating even more space in that garden. And that's going to allow the plants to not be shading one another out, as well as really good airflow throughout them, which decreases the likelihood of any disease setting in on those plants. So for your larger plants, don't be afraid to stagger them rather than drawing them in a straight line, and ensure that you're still giving them the right amount of space. So our tomatoes are in. We are on to our last vegetable and the last portion of step 3. And like I said, step 4 and 5 are a breeze, so we're nearly there. And that 4th vegetable was zucchinis. So I go into my space planner, I look up zucchinis, and as I can see, they're on the large plant side. Now, how many squares are required for zucchinis? 4 squares. So these babies get really, really big. We want to make sure that we're giving them enough space to absolutely thrive. And how many zucchini plants am I going to be fitting into those 4 squares? Only 1. And lastly, how much sun is required for our zucchini babies? That is a full sun plant. So with that, I've got all the information that I need. I go back to my garden and I'm going to now dot off 4 squares, and I'm going to write the letter Z or Z right in the middle of that, knowing that it now has the 4 squares that it requires to grow to its absolute fullest. And right beside it, I'm going to do a second zucchini and also give it 4 squares. So folks, just like that, I've got all of the vegetables that I love and that I'm so excited to be growing, not only into the garden, but spaced out so they each have the best amount of space and placed so that they're in the most optimal environment to absolutely be thriving. So what I encourage you to do is spend a little bit of time with this, getting the vegetables in there, potentially shifting some of them around, and before you know it, it's going to be the middle of summer and you're going to have these garden beds or containers, grow bags, absolutely filled up and thriving with vegetables that you're going to be enjoying all summer long. Quick coffee break before step 4. Whew. All right, step 4, let's dive into it here. And step 4 is all focused on determining how many seeds to start. And so at this point, we are truly into the home stretch when it comes to thinking about our garden plan. And what we want to do is really determine how many seeds should we be starting to bring this garden to life. And so you guessed it, we can do all of this in the garden planning guide. And so what we're going to do is go to the final page of the garden planning guide where there's a chart where we can really quickly and easily find out how many seeds we need to start. So the first thing that we need to do here is add up how many of each vegetable we hope to be growing. So when we go back to kale as the example here, I wrote kale 1, kale 2, kale 3, kale 4. And we know from our space planner that each of those boxes represents 1 plant. So in our garden planning guide, we can see that we've got kale written down there, and the number of drawn out boxes is 4. And now you're going to want to repeat this process for each of the vegetables. So we find our second vegetable, which was basil, and what we can see is that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes. So we go back to our chart and we write in basil, number of squares drawn, 4. But remember, how many basil plants can we fit into each of those squares? Well, on our space planner, it outlined that we can fit 4 basil plants into each of those squares. So we write down the number 4, and now 4 squares drawn multiplied by 4 plants in each of those squares equals a total of 16 basil plants. So we get that written out. Move on to our third vegetable, which was tomatoes. We add them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now we write those into our planting chart. And how many plants are in each of those squares? Only 1, so 6 multiplied by 1 equals 6 tomato plants. And lastly, we put in 2 zucchinis into those huge 4-block chunks. So we write down zucchinis and the number 2, and then the number of plants per square for each of these we know is just 1, so 2 multiplied by 1 equals 2 zucchini plants. And just like that, we have the total list of the number of plants that we are hoping to see in our garden this season. And so all that we need to do from there is now determine how many seeds should we be starting in order to get that number of plants into the garden. And so my rule of thumb is that we basically just start 5 seeds for every 1 plant that we want to have in the garden. So if we wanted to only have one kale plant in the garden, we'd start 5 seeds. Now the reason why I like to start 5 seeds is because if we were starting only 1 seed, there's always going to be a chance that it just doesn't germinate and doesn't begin to grow. So it's decreasing our likelihood of getting that plant. But if we have 5 seeds and we only need one of them to germinate and begin growing, then we have a really high likelihood of one of those 5 seeds germinating, beginning to grow, and us getting the plant into our garden. Now what's more likely to happen is that in lesson number 2, I'm gonna walk you through my method for starting seeds indoors. And if you utilize that method, it's very likely that you're gonna have 2, 3, 4, maybe even all 5 seeds germinate and begin to grow. And so what's likely to happen is that you actually end up with too many seedlings on your hands. And in that instance, what you can do is you can start giving those away to friends, to family. You can start sharing that joy of gardening. So I would always rather veer on the side of having a couple too many seedlings than not enough and not able to fill out my garden. And so that's why my recommendation is to start 5 seeds for every plant. So all that we need to do on this is now we enter the number 5 into our chart so that we can see for each of these plants, we need to now just multiply it by 5 seeds. So using kale as an example, we have 4 plants that we want in our garden. We're gonna be starting 5 seeds for each of those plants, which means we need to start a total of 20 kale seeds. Now, when we go to our basil, we're gonna end up with 16 plants in our garden. And we're gonna start 5 seeds for each of those basil plants, which means, check my math here, but I believe that is 80 seeds that we would be starting for our basil babies. On to our tomatoes, 6 multiplied by 5 is 30, and our zucchinis, 2 multiplied by 5 is 10 zucchini seeds. That's how easy it is. We now know exactly how many seeds we're going to be starting indoors when we get into lesson number 2 of this course here. So you've got all the information that you need on that front. The last piece I'm going to touch on before we wrap up step number 4 is that if it's maybe a little bit later on in the season, or you're kind of right in the beginning of the summertime right now, is I encourage you to actually just buy seedlings rather than starting from seed. We don't want to be starting seeds too late into the season because they're not going to have enough time to mature and ultimately begin developing fruit for you to be enjoying. And so all that you need to do in that instance is that you already have the number of plants that you want to see in your garden: 4 kale plants, 16 basil plants, 6 tomatoes, 2 zucchinis. You basically use that as your shopping list, and you go to your local nursery or your local garden center, and then you just pick up that number of seedlings, and you've saved yourself several months of growing time. So again, even if it's early summer that you're doing this, you absolutely can still have a thriving garden this very first season. And then in year 2, that's when you can get on top of the seed starting indoors a little bit earlier on in the year. So folks, just like that, step 4, it's all done, it's all dusted. We are on to the 5th and final step of this garden planning session. And I'm gonna have a quick sip of coffee and then we're gonna dive in. Alrighty, and so step number 5 is all around determining our seed starting dates. So when do we actually go about starting those kale seeds versus those basil seeds versus the tomato seeds, the zucchini seeds? And what we want to know on this front is that we do not start all of them at the exact same time. And the reason behind this is because some of our seeds are going to be really small, they're going to grow really slowly, and because of that, we need to start them much earlier on in the season. But then there's other seeds like zucchinis, as we'll see in just a second, is that they're going to germinate fast, and as soon as those babies start to grow, they get huge very, very quickly. So we don't want to start those ones too early, because if we did, then they're going to outgrow the indoor growing space, and it's going to get a little bit too chaotic in there. They're going to get really stressed out, but it might not be warm enough to be transplanting them outside. And if we did, because we ran out of space inside, then ultimately we're exposing them to temperatures that are way too cold for them, which is really gonna stress them and stunt them, and they're not gonna be nearly as productive or thriving as what we're hoping to see. So starting them at the right time is the really key last step here. How do we go about doing that? Well, you guessed it, we got another resource for you on this front, completely for free. And so this one is actually put together from my friends at West Coast Seeds. And what they have is called a planting chart. And what this planting chart does is it outlines every seed and when you go about starting it. So the first thing that you're going to do is find your growing zone. For Canada, they outline every single growing zone in here. So for myself in South Coastal BC, I'm gonna go ahead and flip to that page. And now all that I need to do is basically look up the first vegetable that I wrote out, which is kale, and find it in the planting chart. And so I go down and I find kale, and then I scroll over to what month can I start these seeds in, and it says March. So I'm now gonna go back to the chart that I filled out for the number of seeds that I'm starting, and I'm writing in March. Perfect. Continue along to my second vegetable, which is basil. And I look up the basil, and it's saying that I can start those in April. All right, so I write April into my chart. Perfect. On to our last two final vegetables here. The next one up is tomatoes. I go down and I find those, and we can get those babies started in March as well. And lastly, zucchinis, which is actually listed as squash in the planting chart here. And as I can see, those ones were starting in April because they begin growing so fast. And just like that, folks, we have not only determined the vegetables that we're so excited to be growing, placed them into our garden with the right amount of spacing, but we've also determined how many seeds we're going to be starting. And lastly here, we determined when we're going to go about starting those seeds. You have done amazing if you have made it this far, and you have the blueprint in your hands to have an absolutely incredible garden this coming season. And so the question really becomes, well, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? And so the very next lesson in this course is I'm going to walk you through my method for starting each one of these seeds indoors. I'm going to walk you through all the materials that I utilize and step by step how to go about it so that you have a really high germination rate and ultimately plant babies that are totally thriving. It's super straightforward. It's actually really, really easy to do, and it's gonna be a really fun lesson. So I hope that this has been helpful when it comes to building out your garden planet and ultimately creating this garden that's gonna bring you so much more than just the fruits, the vegetables, the flowers that we're planning to grow. So I can't wait to catch you in lesson number 2. I'll see you over there when you're all set, and until then, go get those hands dirty. Catch you soon.